Every gardener I know, myself included, has said it. It's just been too hot, or we haven't had enough rain. But here's the truth: blaming the weather might actually be holding you back. What if the weather isn't always the culprit? And even if it is, are we just going to sit back and let it win? I've actually seen this reaction in a completely different world back when I worked in the car business, and the parallel is too good not to share. In case you haven't heard my backstory, I worked at a Ford dealership for 10 years. For most of those years, I was the business development manager, and among many of our roles, we would take phone calls and internet inquiries from people looking to purchase vehicles. Our job was to answer questions and ultimately to make an appointment for the prospect to come in and talk to a sales associate in person. When we weren't fielding incoming inquiries, we were making outgoing phone calls, sending emails, and sending postcards to past customers and prospects. Often, though, during the fall, and especially during the economic downturn of 2008, we found that the phones stopped ringing as frequently and the internet inquiries were starting to slow down. The easiest thing to say during those times when our appointment board looked sparse was, well, it's just that time of year right now and people aren't thinking about buying cars. Or, look over there, the parking lot at the unemployment office next door is full. People can't afford to buy a car right now. Or, gas is $4 a gallon and nobody is buying trucks and SUVs, which was the bread and butter of the dealership that I worked for. In other words, when our job was literally to develop new business, the easy reflex was to blame factors outside of our control. Now, if you're wondering why I'm talking about the car business on a gardening podcast, I'm getting there. I just want to paint the picture because sometimes I think our knee-jerk reaction to outside influences is very normal. At the core, it assuages our guilt of not being as successful as we want to be. But ultimately, did fixating on factors beyond our control actually drive any new vehicle sales? Even if those factors were real? No. In fact, it did the opposite. It gave us excuses. We were more prone to be lazy than work on what we could control. So hear me out. I think gardeners, myself included, are tempted in the same way when it comes to how our weather affects our gardens. Yes, no doubt about it, absolutely, weather is a factor, and we need to be aware of how it affects what we grow. But if we're going to become successful gardeners, especially over time, we have to stop blaming the weather for every failure. That mindset, which I've had myself, doesn't help the cucumbers to grow better next year. But I'm also not saying that we give weather a free pass. Instead, we need to take a real look of how we observe our gardens, what the weather is responsible for, what the weather isn't responsible for, and what we can do about it either way. This episode is going to be more of a tough love conversation, but ultimately, I want to emphasize the love part because I want you to be successful. Now, as you listen to today's podcast episode, feel free to multitask. There's no checklist to write down or no notes to take. Just listen in and let's talk about how we can deal with the weather and the things that are absolutely in our control. Now, before we dive in, if you're new here, welcome. Most weeks in this podcast, you'll find practical how-to advice that will help you grow your own food in your own backyard. But I also know that the garden is just one part of your life. If you're like many listeners, you garden for more than just the harvest. You do it for your mental health, a chance to enjoy the outdoors and the sunshine, and as a way to move your body that doesn't require a weighted vest. That's why today I'm going to appeal to you as a gardener, because when you have a good mindset, that's going to help your garden. So, with all that said, let's talk about the weather, shall we? Going back to what I first said at the beginning, how many times have I heard or have I said, we've just been so hot this year, or it hasn't rained in weeks, or the spring was just so wet, or our last frost was 3 weeks after it was supposed to be, or we went from hot to cold in the matter of days. I could go on. We talk about the weather a lot, but what's behind those statements if we think about it? Let's think about some of the examples I just shared. Well, the cucumbers have seemed to stop growing and the ones that I do have are bitter. Or the spring was just so wet. disease took hold of the tomatoes and wouldn't let go. Or our last frost was 3 weeks after it was supposed to be. And what ended up happening was my peppers were damaged and I'm not sure if they'll rebound. Or what about the fall garden? We went from hot to cold in a matter of days. My supposed cold tolerant crops are wilted. Now what? As you can see, it's not just about the weather. It's how the weather affects our gardens, right? And the more we garden, the more we start to see trends. Here are some of the things that I have seen in my years of gardening. When we have early wet springs, tomato diseases tend to be a big problem, but they do so much better with longer periods in between rain. So that's something that I can observe in my garden. Or when there's a dry period about a month before our average last frost in the spring, if I can get my potatoes in the ground, they perform better. But if it's too wet, often if I get them planted anyway, they'll either rot in the ground or they'll get a late start altogether, which ultimately affects my yield. What about persistent heat in the fall? That's pretty common, but what I've noticed is that often it'll make my broccoli plants taller and weaker, which delays their head production, and even the production that I do get is typically less than usual. So yes, we can look at different trends that we see in our gardens over the years. Observing is the first step. Now, sorry, even on a podcast where the focus here is us talking about your mindset, I still can't help but giving you a few steps. So we're actually going to go 3 steps today. The first one is observe. Now, if you're a beginner, you don't know yet how weather affects your garden and how weather is affecting your plants. You may either default for blaming it for everything or blaming it for nothing, and instead you blame everything on yourself. Neither of those is helpful. And I hope you can see that here. Now, let's take a step back and let me repeat that because I think it's something that new gardeners really get tripped up on. Either everything's the weather's fault, so none of it's my fault and I can move on, or we don't even consider the weather and I'm just a terrible gardener. Neither of those is going to help you as a gardener. But here's the thing. I know you want answers, but often the best conclusions are those that you arrive at after several seasons and beyond one simple observation. I am still observing and I'm still learning and I'm still realizing, unfortunately, that some of my old conclusions have been wrong. So observation is a lifelong journey. It's something that none of us is ever going to grow out of, but it is so important. But what do we do with the observations that we have? And that's the thing that I want to talk to you about. First of all, we need to remember what we observe. Our memory is only going to take us so far. And depending on our age, our memory may be better at some ages than others, I'm realizing. So one thing that can be helpful is journaling. Journaling what you're seeing, journaling your weather trends. If you have my complete garden planner, I have an area in that where you're able to write down what was the weather this week and what am I observing this week. This is really helpful, if nothing else, than to just help you be mindful of what may be going on, even if you don't have conclusions yet. But it's also good to look back on and see, wow, I had a really great tomato season last year. Let's go look and see if weather may have had an impact on that. It's something that we can look back in the past. But realistically, this is something that I haven't always been able to keep up with. Even though it's a good practice, sometimes just doing it is not realistic for many of us. But in the future, honestly, I would love to begin to leverage AI for this because I have realized that AI is really good at data analysis and trend spotting, and it's only going to get better. So how I'm going to use this, I'm not really sure, but what I can tell you is there may be a way that we can use just our regular free ChatGPT account to write down observations, and it can even pull weather data from local weather stations. So maybe you don't even have to do that. Or maybe you can go back. I haven't necessarily tried this and like, okay, what were the trends for this zip code in 2023? And you can start seeing that maybe there were some trends there that it can pull up for you quicker than you crunching numbers. I mean, if you're a number cruncher and you like doing that, go for it. But a lot of us just don't have time for that. So consider how you might be able to leverage AI in that way. That's something I may explore a little bit more. So I don't have a how-to for you, but it's just something to put in the back of your head. Another thing you can do is hopefully you're taking pictures already of your garden. And what you can do is you can go back and you can review them. One thing that I have found helpful is that if I have put any photos of my garden on Facebook, I pull up and it's like on this day. And just side note, this just reminds me, my son and I were at lunch yesterday. He's a freshman in college now, and he and I were sitting, and I was eating a salad and he was eating lunch beside me, and I was pulling up Facebook, and I pulled up the memories, and I showed a picture of him reading to his sister back when he was in elementary school and she was in preschool. And he's like, "Is this what you do every day, is you just go back and look at memories?" And I'm like, "Yeah, exactly." And just like we do that with our kids, we can do that with our gardens. And the thing that I like about it is because it says on this day, whether this is Facebook or Instagram, is you can compare. And sometimes I'm like, man, that year, those plants were way far ahead of what they are right now. Or they looked really a lot better that year than they do now. Or the opposite, man, those don't look near as healthy as what they do now. And as we're going to see it in a second, that may not always be because of weather, but we can take some of these things into consideration as we're looking at what happened this same time of year, if we're in the same garden location, and just compare them with photos. Now, this may be whether we're doing journaling or we're observing photos or whatever we're doing to reflect, some things that we can ask ourselves is, why are our crops behind or ahead compared to last year? Was the weather any different? Or are there other factors that may be in play? And ultimately, you can consider, what might the weather be responsible for? Now, that doesn't mean we're indicting the weather 100% of the time, but we are allowing ourselves to be curious. What could the weather be responsible for? So let me give you an example. I may have mentioned this on the podcast that I'm starting a new lettuce this year that I've heard really good things about it being very cold hardy, cold tolerant, and it's called Rouge de Vert. And then I also was starting a lettuce in the summer that's supposed to be warm, like more heat tolerant, called Sunland. But I noticed that in my garden, whether it was Sunland in the summer or Rouge de Vert in September when we were still kind of warm, but not super hot, I noticed that they both started having a similar growth tendency. And what ended up happening is, instead of being compact and frilly and strong, they were kind of leggy. They started developing that central stalk that's usually what you would see if they start bolting, although they're not bolting. Maybe it's the beginning part of it, very potentially, but they look different. And so what I'm observing here is, okay, what's similar? I'm actually growing these two at two different times. Sunland was growing in July under shade cloth, but Rouge de Vert was growing in September. Although we were still in the 80s and early 90s, what could be the problem? And my theory is that these crops are not as robust in early heat. They don't really love the early heat. And so this may or may not be true, but I'm noticing how these romaine lettuces are responding to warmer than typical conditions that lettuce like, compared to some of my other ones that are thriving. Like loose leaves, like New Red Fire. I'm loving New Red Fire, and it's doing so much better. And so I'm able to compare, okay, I think New Red Fire is going to be a lot better with heat, so that'll give me information for next year. So all that to say is that observing what could the weather be a factor in. Here's another example, and this is one that many of us have probably experienced if we've been watching. If we get really hot periods in the summer, like temperatures above 90 to 95, what we will notice is that many times, especially if we live in a humid area, the flowers of our tomatoes will start to wither and drop, and they don't start producing fruit. But I've noticed this, if we get any kind of a cool front in the summer, where the temperatures are below 90, which that's a cool front for us in the summer, many times what I'll see is this flush of flowers and baby tomatoes start to form. Well, this started happening year after year after year, and then realizing after studying online, because we can find all sorts of information online. So I realized, yes, this was actually due to the weather, and I realized the botanical reasons why, but it was something I truly could assume is blamed on the weather. Now, we always have to keep in mind that correlation does not equal causation, something I'll never forget from my years as a psychology undergrad, but we can start to spot trends. And that's the key that we want to do as we get more and more experience as a gardener, more and more years under our belts as we start to spot trends. And we may not be able to say 100% that the weather was a factor. We start leaning more toward that, and then we can start making better informed decisions based on some of those trends. Step number 2 is we want to consider what other factors might be in play. Remember when I said often new gardeners, they'll blame everything on the weather? Well, what we want to do is we want to dial that back and understand weather may play a role, but let's just put that on a shelf for now and let's think, could there be something else? Most often, there could be an issue with the soil quality. Instead of blaming the weather right off the bat, let's observe our soil quality. What were our raised beds filled with? What might there be other issues? Did we do a soil test? If we're gardening in containers, are we watering them enough? Are we fertilizing them enough? If the fertilizer isn't enough for the whole season in containers, which it honestly sometimes isn't. What is the issue? Could there be an issue with the amount of sun they're getting or the amount of shade they're getting? And then they still struggled, but I think that early sun really hurt them. Maybe your crops are not growing very fast because they didn't have enough sunlight to begin with. So that may be an issue. Irrigation, always check. If you're irrigating too much, then your plants are going to suffer because the roots are not going to have the oxygen they need. Or maybe you're not irrigating enough. Maybe you need to check that. I have gone out a couple of times this summer, even though I've had irrigation, I've had my Garden in Minutes garden grid going on a timer. I'll still go out and I'll use a moisture meter and I'll check. At one time, I thought that irrigation was sufficient. And when I put the moisture meter down about 6 inches, it was bone dry. And I'm like, okay, I need to up this. I need to get it going every day, or I need to put it longer in the days that's growing. So keeping an eye on irrigation. I mentioned particularly needing to supplement with fertilizer, potentially, especially if your crops are in containers, but even if they're not. Just the other day, I walked outside and I had some squash and zucchini in a raised bed, and one of them was looking a little more pale than the other ones. And I thought, this particular bed had potatoes in it. The potatoes may have gotten a lot of the nutrients, so I'm going to supplement with a liquid fertilizer. It may not be the weather. It may be that they don't have the nutrients they need. This is important that we step back and we consider what other factors may be at play. Because if we stop at step number 1 to observe and we right off the bat conclude that it's weather, then we're not going to go any further to diagnose the problem. Because what if it isn't the weather? Now, I want to give a case in point example that if you've been here for a while, you've heard this example, but I feel like it is spot on to what we're talking about right now. I remember when I was a first-time gardener, and my mom was still living and she had grown vegetables all her life. And I remember struggling with squash in the middle of the summer and they started wilting. And she was like, well, squash doesn't do well in the heat of the summer. And I just kind of took her at her word because, she's the one that had decades of gardening experience, under her belt. But for some reason I discovered, and I'm not really sure even how I did this, maybe doing some research, I discovered this little grub called the squash vine borer that I had never heard of before, but I researched what was the result of the squash vine borer. Well, it's wilting of squash and eventually it dies. And so I was thinking, okay, well, I did some surgery on the squash and I found the grub. So I was able to identify that it was the squash vine borer. And I thought, what if squash actually doesn't have a problem in the heat like my mom had always assumed? What if all this time she thought squash couldn't grow in the summer when in fact, it was the squash vine borer that causes the plant to wilt and die. And it's always at the time when it starts getting hot. Because in my area, the squash vine borer shows up usually in the middle of June, and my plant is gone by the beginning of July, which is just when our temperatures in Arkansas are starting to heat up. So there was a correlation there, and it was an easy assumption that squash didn't like the heat. But once I realized that that wasn't the culprit, and I realized that the culprit was an evil little bug that that I still struggle with, then I was able to be like, okay, so what can we do about that? And so for me, what I eventually landed on after trying lots of different things that didn't work is I just let it go and then I plant again. I plant again. This year, I think I planted middle of July. And the squash that I particularly mentioned that are in my garden right now, that's when I planted them. And if I had thought that squash can't handle the heat, I would, for goodness sake, wouldn't be planting in the middle of July, right? Because we get the hottest in August. But what I have found is that these crops usually do really great in August and September going into fall. But if I would have held on to that assumption that, oh, it's the weather's fault, it's too hot for these plants, then I wouldn't have specific reason that it actually ultimately ended up being. So I don't know that many of our examples are going to be that black and white, but I feel like it was a good case in point that it's a really good idea to step back and think, okay, weather may be the culprit or it may be a contributing factor, but what else could it be? Step number 3, if it is weather, then what? This is what I think separates a casual gardener from a smart gardener. The truth is, sometimes it is the weather. But that doesn't mean we'll just pack up our toys and leave thinking that we'll never have a thriving garden or that we can't work around weather extremes, because we can. We just have to be willing to think outside the box and also watch what other gardeners are doing to get some ideas. Because honestly, we've got to be real here. I have seen an uptick in each year. It's like weather this, weather that. And then yes, while I think some of it is blaming the weather like we talked about before, some of it I think is legitimately things are different. If you talk to gardeners who've been gardening for longer than I have, they'll tell you things are different. So we have to learn how to adapt. Otherwise, then what? We can't just blame the weather and just go on. I mean, you're spending so much time and energy pouring into something that you want to be fulfilling for you. What can we do then? So let me give you some examples of some ways that you can and I have worked around the legitimate issues that have come along in terms of weather challenges. So number 1, probably the most common that may be on your mind as we're heading out of summer is if your tomatoes won't produce in the heat of the summer, as in the flowers are drying up and dropping and you're not getting a harvest in the heat of the summer, consider your planting times. For me, I'm planting tomatoes as early as I can, as soon as that frost is passed, as soon as weather's in the 50s. Like I am watching the weather like a hawk to get those in there. There are a lot of people that will tell you there's no hurry. Most people plant too early and you can wait. There's no problem with waiting. Well, that may be the case in some climates, and that may be the case in your climate. That actually may be fantastic advice. But I know and I have observed in my garden in Arkansas that we go from cold to hot so fast. And I know what's going to happen when late June comes around. I know what's going to happen with the flowers on my tomato plants. So I know I've got to plant early. This is something that I teach in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden. It's not open right now, but it's something I harp on is if you are in a climate like mine, you've got to keep this in mind because planting as early as possible, that way it's still not too cold, but doing that will help you get an early harvest. But also planting later. This is something that I'm experimenting with this year. In July, I planted another round of tomatoes. They're still growing in my garden right now. I've got green tomatoes, they're Roma tomatoes, and my hope is that I can get a good harvest before the frost so that I can put them up for canning and such. But knowing that that center part of the summer is going to be really hard for the tomatoes to produce, planting early and planting late is how I'm working around this. Another thing you can do, and a lot of gardeners do, is adding shade cloth. Adding shade cloth can make a difference of just a few degrees that may make those flowers not dry up, but actually pollinate. So adding shade cloth is something you can also work around. Another thing you can do, and this is something that I learned in one of our hottest summers that I had ever experienced, is learn to plant heat-tolerant varieties of tomatoes if you live in an area like I do where it gets really hot. I learned in that one particular summer which varieties were completely non-starters. They hated the heat. Amish paste was one of them, and I'm like, well, that figures. I think it came from Pennsylvania, which is they're not going to be as hot as early as us. So I learned which ones actually did well. Hungarian heart did really well. San Marzano, it wasn't that one. It was, I think, Pomodoro Squisito actually did better than San Marzano in my heat. So all that to say, adjust the varieties that you grow because some of them are going to be more tolerant to different conditions. Another example is I thought this for years. I can't grow lettuce in the summer for salads. It's too hot for that. Well, some of the workarounds I've had is I start indoors because I know that I can get the seeds to germinate indoors. And then when I plant them out, I plant them out in the shade. And even on the hottest days, misting them with water is something you can do. I learned that from farmers market gardeners. Those are some things that you can do to work around. You can also, and this is what I do a lot, is switch to arugula or other brassica greens. Some people even grow Malabar spinach as a more of a heat tolerant option. And so basically working around what you're growing instead of trying to force some of these things to grow when they don't like to grow, what other options might there be? Another thing that you can do is you can incorporate growing in raised beds or grow bags. In particular, I started doing this with potatoes because, again, in my climate, we need to get potatoes in early because potatoes don't like the heat and our heat comes in fast. And I noticed the later I got potatoes in, the less of a harvest I got. But if I try to plant it too early and we get a wet spring, then my potatoes are going to rot in the ground and it's just a big challenge. But I realized that if I switch to growing them in raised beds or grow bags, the saturated soil in those places was not near as bad as my clay in-ground soil. And I was able to get them to be able to harvest when I switched how I grew them. And that, again, is looking at the realities of the weather and my particular climate and adjusting. Another thing that I noticed is that our spring tend to be up and down, like warm spring and then freezing again. It was roller coaster weather. When it comes to onions, that was not a recipe for success. I started having a lot of problems, or I actually always did from the very beginning, having a lot of problems with onions bolting prematurely. So I'm like, okay, given my up and down spring weather, what can I do? So I experimented with different plant timing, planting some varieties a little later. I experimented with trying different day lengths, going to intermediate day onions instead of short day. I experimented with starting them from seed because I had heard that starting from seed leads to less bolting. There were lots of things that I started experimenting with because I realized that, okay, I can't control the warm and cold fronts in the spring, so I'm going to try some things to work around it, and it's worked. These are all examples from my garden, and if you do not live in an area similar to mine, they're not going to 100% cross over and apply to you. But the reason I tell you this is because in your climate, it's important to observe, but also experiment. If something didn't work, and if you know it didn't work because, man, there's nothing else I can figure out was the problem except for weather, then experiment with ways to get around it. Try new things. I heard this recently on a podcast, and I can't even remember which one it was, but basically, when this person looked at doing something new, she's like, there's no such thing as failure. It's only information. And I think that's so good for us gardeners to understand when we're trying to decide and test new things is, you know what? If it doesn't work, that's not a failure. That's a win because we learned what didn't work and we can keep going and keep experimenting. So what I want you to get from today's episode is that yes, weather is a very real factor in the growth of our plants, but blaming the weather and stopping there may help us feel vindicated somewhat when things fail in the garden, but it ultimately does not help us grow more food. The better plan is to observe and consider what weather truly is responsible for and what it's not, and then think through what you can try to do to help mitigate its effects on your crops. So the next time you start hearing yourself saying, oh, it's too hot or it's too wet, pause and remember the weather might be part of the story, but it's never the whole story. And that means that there's always something that you can do. I want you to realize that you're not helpless against the weather. Take agency over what you can control. Sometimes, yes, we throw in the towel. We're like, this is not working. But often, if we just think outside the box a little bit, then we can realize that there are things that we can do. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. If you have found this conversation helpful, one of the best ways that you can support this podcast and make sure you don't miss future episodes is just to make sure you're following. Hit follow in whatever podcasting app you're using, and even share it with a friend who could use some extra encouragement in their garden. And if you'd like more helpful tips, timely reminders, and exclusive resources that I only share with my subscribers delivered straight to your email inbox, I would love for you to join my email community at journeywithjill.net/garden signup. Those weekly emails on Fridays are where I share exclusive resources and behind the scenes updates that I don't include anywhere else. So I hope to see you there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. If you have a thought that you would like to share with me, you can either comment if you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, or you can DM me at The Beginner's Garden on Instagram. I would love to hear from you. And I hope you have a great day this beautiful September day. I'll chat with you next week.